I'm Mark Halperin.
And I'm John Heilemann. And with all due respect to Halloween, we're too tired to go trick-or-treating because we've been working our fingers to the bone. Okay. Happy Cabbage Night, sports fans, or Halloween Eve, if you prefer simplicity. In our haunted house tonight, the hunt for Trump and Carson, the night of the living Jeb, and our potion-making pollster and Selzer. But first, the thing. It's Marco Rubio. After his Boffo debate performance, Rubio's campaign and supporters are happier than a trick-or-treater in the rich part of town where all the king-size baby Ruths reside. They say Rubio is now the go-to guy in the non-grievance candidate bracket. And speaking of swagger, Rubio's super PAC put out a memo today saying that Marco is one of only 4 Republicans who can win the nomination. Not mentioned in that video, left out, John Ellis Bush. And David Brooks went even further than that, gushing in the New York Times that Rubio is the party's most likely standard bearer. Mark, noted stock picker and analyst that you are, is the Rubio stock currently overvalued?
He's hot, he's rising in a lot of metrics, but until he rises in the polls and until he actually shows that he can turn this good fortune into money, he is an overvalued stock. But make no mistake, in the psyops war between Rubio and Bush, Rubio continues to win. The super PAC putting out a memo saying that Carson, Trump, Cruz, and Rubio can be nominated, not Bush, is intentional. And
provocative.
It's meant to crush Bush's spirit.
Well, it's not just meant to crush his spirit. I think it's also meant to draw Jeb into attacking Marco more, because I think they see the division in the Bush campaign over whether negative works. They want to get him to attack him over this voting record thing because they think it makes Bush look small, petty, and defensive.
The other thing that Rubio is going for him now is social media and the internet on the conservative side is becoming increasingly pro-Marco, because Marco versus Jeb, they don't love Marco in every quarter of the conservative media, but they love him a lot more than they love Jeb Bush.
I'll tell you, Jeff Guerin, Democratic pollster, sends out a thing to smart people, insiders, more Democrats and Republicans, but a lot of Republicans. He got about 200 responses asking people who the Republican nominee was going to be. 71% or 70, almost 70% say Marco Rubio. That is an overvalued stock. I'm sorry, Marco may be rising, but he's not 70. He's got Donald Trump at 4%.
We've got polling, national and some state polling coming next week from various quarters.
We'll see how much he rises.
And we'll see how much he rises. You think he's going to rise, I think, more than I do. But if he rises in the polls, the momentum will get supercharged.
Yeah, supercharged.
And then everyone else in the field is going to have to figure out what to do about it.
But I still can't believe, I mean, it tells you just how much the inside the Beltway establishment opinion is swung pro-Rubio for a lot of reasons, not just because of this debate performance, but because they look at him, they say, young, could appeal to Hispanics. He's the one who makes sense on some weird level.
A lot of Democrats are not nearly as afraid of Marco Rubio as some people think, but we'll see what happens. All right, Jeb Bush's campaign is still in a very tough place. The storyline is bad, so every development is seen through a spooky prism. The latest sign of trouble for Bush, his campaign's chief operating officer abruptly left the campaign with no explanation as to why. Bush is still trying to ease donor concerns after that poor debate performance. He's going to be in Iowa this weekend, and he's launching a Jeb Can Fix It tour in Florida and South Carolina next week. So, John, we're on day 2 now of tracking Jeb. Is it a death watch, or is he at the beginning of a comeback?
I'm checking the pulse of that man. It's still weak right now. I haven't seen them do anything other than Jeb promising to donors that yesterday that he would get better in some kind of undefinable way. I haven't seen them do anything in the last 24 hours that makes me think that they've turned the corner and they're going to come storming back.
Here's the worst thing I think he did since the debate. He announced that the reason he's going to be coming back is because he has a lot of money.
Right.
You know, an organization.
Right.
Message. The problem for Bush now is that everybody is on death watch. Everybody's turned against him, or almost everybody. Yeah. He needs some good news. The super PAC already went on TV with ads. That didn't raise his poll numbers. He either needs rising poll numbers, he needs a strong debate performance in the next debate in Milwaukee, or something else. The release of his book is probably not good enough news to turn this around, to get the narrative back where he can go after Rubio. Yeah, well, he didn't go after Rubio when he was strong. Now he's weak.
Right. All those things are fair enough. But I got to say, it's still the case that he does not have, on the basis of everything you and I jointly have seen in early states, he does not have voters, actual voters, human beings out there saying, I want to vote for this guy.
No problem.
All right. Real quick, some Democratic footnotes. Bernie Sanders says his campaign has received contributions from more than 750,000 people. That is a lot of people. And in Hillary Clinton news, the New York Times reports that the White House will block the State Department from releasing Clinton's email correspondence with Obama from when she was Secretary of State, citing executive privilege. And one more thing. Today, at a campaign event in Atlanta, Clinton was interrupted by protesters from Black Lives Matter movement. So, Mark, as the week ends, what is the state of ye olde Democratic race?
Bernie Sanders, I think, needs another debate to get the national conversation going, to get some national momentum. But he continues to raise money, as we saw today. Hillary Clinton still has problems, as we saw in the two things you just talked about. But I think just as the next debate is key on the Republican side is key for Jeb, the next debate is key for Bernie Sanders. And just as Jeb is kind of flummoxed about going after Marco, whether he can be negative, Bernie is now flummoxed about whether he can go after Hillary. Both those guys need to sort that out because they are going to have to do contrast to get ahead.
As you know, when I wrote about the Sanders campaign earlier this week, I quoted Tad Devine saying that they did about 15 hours of debate prep last time, and Tad quoted on the record said we needed about 150. So they are going to try to focus on getting Bernie Sanders ready and trying to figure out a way to do contrast where it's on the issues only, not personal, not about character, but on the issues only. I think there's a little bit of baloney about that because the issues contrast they want to do really go to character. But the question still remains, can Sanders execute?
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting is there's so much confidence now in the Clinton camp. And, if you ask Republicans now who the Democratic nominee is going to be, they almost all say Hillary Clinton. I think the thing that Sanders has to do, besides obviously build on the ground in Iowa, New Hampshire, is get back to convincing people that he can win. Joe Biden's departure mathematically makes that a taller order for him.
Right.
We all know it's all about Iowa and New Hampshire. He's got to convince people in those states he can beat her in those states.
Right. And the key thing I think there is Iowa, because the truth is it's now all looking like an Iowa race, right? If Hillary Clinton wins Iowa, she probably will be the nominee. I mean, again, pending some weird thing that happens. Sanders wins Iowa, he could win New Hampshire, and then everything gets crazy. So the question is, what is Sanders' Iowa operation like? What do the reliable polls in Iowa say about the standing out there? Sanders got to show some life out there. These last couple of polls obviously have put him way behind. I don't think anybody believes he's that far behind, but he's got to look like he's close.
Yep. All right, big news from the White House today. American Special Ops Forces, fewer than 50 of them, according to the administration, are going to be on the ground in northern Syria for the first time to help rebels fight ISIS. Press Secretary Josh Earnest at the White House downplayed the significance of the move and said it's not part of any new strategy. The new Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, and some of the Republican presidential candidates, such as Lindsey Graham, are already questioning this decision. John, why is President Obama putting 50 American troops on the ground when he said he would not?
Well, I think because the situation there is deteriorating, because he's trying to do something to try to get a handle on a, as I say, deteriorating situation. I think Republicans who claim that it's too little, that it's not part of a comprehensive strategy, they got a strong point.
Yeah, I think the Pentagon probably told the White House they needed this to make sure that the airstrikes could be coordinated. But this move, as much attention as it's gotten today, is not nearly as important as the peace talks.
Right.
The White House needs to figure out in these negotiations that are going on with John Kerry and the Russians, the Saudis, the Iranians, and others, can they live with an interim government? Can they let Assad stay for some period of time? And I think the U.S. is headed towards that, and that will make the military stuff much less significant because, as the president himself said, John Kerry has said, there's no military solution.
There is only a political solution, and I think you and I have been seeing and hearing for about a month that there's more of an openness now inside the administration to not the Assad doesn't have to go, and let's get this thing stabilized, and then we can figure out a political end game later on.
Yeah. The other thing is 50 is just such a ridiculously number. There must be more special ops people going in that are secret. There have to be, and there have to be some, of course, already on the ground. But 50, the price you pay for doing it versus the 50, again, the Pentagon must have pushed hard to say we just can't do what you're asking us to do unless we've got better coordination of our folks on the ground. So
you say 50 when you're sending 500, but you just don't say anything.
I doubt it's 500.
You know what I mean? But it's like a fig leaf for a larger force.
It's got to be more.
I think that's probably right. Okay. Who will crawl out of our WADR crypt after the break? It could be Ann Selzer, or it could be Craig Shirley. Ooh, stay with us, trick-or-treaters. We'll be right back.
Our guest tonight is not the least bit spooky. It's Bloomberg pollster Ann Selzer. president of Selzer and Company in Des Moines, Iowa, who joins us on a pilgrimage from the Mecca in the Midwest. And a lot of Iowa polling lately, including the Des Moines Register, Bloomberg Politics Iowa poll, where Trump and Carson are ahead.
Yes.
They're counting on bringing a lot of first-time voters. How does your polling test the question of whether they can be successful? Is it possible that your polling would understate how they're doing because you're oversampling regular voters?
Actually, I'm not oversampling regular voters, and my poll is designed to abide by the science of polling, which is everybody who's going to show up on caucus night has an equal chance of being contacted by my poll. I don't decide based on past voting behavior. All I can do is whether you're registered to vote right now. And does that lose some people? Because there's some people who can register on caucus night, and you can be 17 and still participate if you will be 18 by November. But it's a pretty full sample frame for the universe that we have.
But in the universe of Trump and Carson in particular going for, like Obama did, and trying to bring in new people, many of those people might not be registered yet, and as you said, may just show up on caucus night. Is there a way to capture that?
There's not a way with our method to capture that, and I don't like feeling uncomfortable about my method. My goal is to not regret anything that we can do. It is a small universe of people who show up on caucus night, and if suddenly there was an influx, that would be problematic. But their campaigns, who are identifying all those voters, are getting them registered ahead of caucus night. They don't want a big line at the door. So we're updating our lists all the time so that we have the freshest data.
So in 2008, when you were real close and accurate on tracking Barack Obama's progress.
That's right.
You were basically, it's possible that if you had called someone to poll them in 2007, they may not have said they were a registered voter, and there you would have skipped them. But later on
caught them. Our final poll said 60% of the people who were going to show up on the Democratic side would be first-time caucus goers. That was an alarmingly large number.
Right.
The entrance poll said it was 57%.
And what are you finding it to be now?
We're now in the more 30% range for both parties, that this is going to be their first caucus, 20 to 30% range. But as it gets closer, things get more exciting. But I'm telling you, it's in the candidate's best interest to have those people registered before.
As soon as possible.
So they can get into caucus night swiftly. Because people will, if it's their first time and there's a big long line, give up, go home.
So there's always a lot of talk in our business about various lanes.
Yes.
There's the anti-establishment lane, the establishment lane, the protest candidates, the grievance candidates, whatever you want to call those anti-establishment ones. Right now in Iowa, pretty consistently, we see that group, whatever you want to call them, over 50%. Carson, Trump, Fiorina, throw Cruz in there, you're way over 50. The establishment candidates get way less than 50 right now. They're down 18, 17, under 20. So where's the rest of that establishment vote right now? Is it just all those establishment voters are undecided currently, or is the electorate in some fundamental way shifted?
Well, it's a little bit of a misnomer to decide that you have two discrete units that want an outsider and who want an establishment candidate. We asked in our last poll a question about, is it a greater risk to keep doing the same thing, that is, electing the establishment person, or is it a greater risk to have an outsider who doesn't know what they're doing? And if you break those two apart more, Republicans, 60% said it's a greater risk to keep doing the same thing. So that's, in theory, they want an outsider. But Trump and Carson lead in that group. And Trump and Carson lead with the people who say the greater risk is to have somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. So people aren't lining up the way you might wish them to very cleanly. Iowa looks at everybody first. And their job is to kind of keep an open mind, try people on. Well, right now they're trying on Carson and Trump. And that's not to say that they won't change.
Sure. But if you thought about that segment of the electorate that is undecided right now, that chunk in Iowa, who are they?
Well, it's not that big a group, actually, who are undecided, who have no first choice in our polling. It's sort of 15%, 12%. Who are they? They tend to be people who aren't paying as much attention. They tend to be younger.
It's not a bunch of establishment voters, traditional establishment voters who still haven't settled between Bush, Christie, between the establishment candidates. That's not who that group is.
Because we offer them opportunities to rate their favorability, I don't think that's what's going on. I don't have perfect data for you, John.
We talked earlier in the program about Marco Rubio as the hot candidate. He spent some time in Iowa, but not as much as a lot of the other leading candidates. And according to our reporting, he's not built much of what is called an organization. Has Iowa changed? Is it possible to do well in the caucuses, first, second, or third, without building an organization and simply, like in a primary, run television ads and do some campaigning?
Well, we saw Steve Forbes try to do that and said, never come to the state, never organize anything, and he didn't do very well. He thought just money will cure it all. We saw Rick Santorum, who had a pickup truck and spent a lot of time, but he didn't have a lot of county chairs. He didn't have a lot of people who were in the traditional way organized. So you can there are lots of ways to win the Iowa caucuses. It's a more secure bet that if you've got a good organization that has identified people and have them sign out pledge cards, I mean, that's a persuasion event that you're now committed to show up on that night and support that person. You're going to have more people show up on that night and support you.
So normally there's a relatively clear divergence between the national polls and Iowa polls. The Iowa, especially on the Republican side, different kind of electorate, right? Mm-hmm. So far this year, there's been pretty close tracking between the two. Do you think as we get closer to the caucus that the polls are going to start to diverge, the national and what we see in Iowa, or is this election going to be different, where somehow Iowa is actually going to reflect the national mood of the Republican Party?
I wish I could predict how that's going to go. What I see happening is that the more candidates are spending time in Iowa, the more they're starting to spend money in Iowa, the more they're advertising in Iowa, and that's much less expensive than doing all of this nationally. You're going to see who is getting traction in Iowa first. And so what we just saw were two polls, the Quinnipiac and our poll, come out and show that Carson was now leading, and then took a little while, but the national polls began to reflect that. So Iowa is influential in a lot of ways. It's the most important thing a candidate can do, which is win. It's the first place to win, and so they're going to be spending their time there, and I wouldn't be surprised if national polls follow Iowa.
Right. And do you think, what about the Democratic side? It's still interesting that when people can understand why Sanders and Clinton are so close in New Hampshire, or Sanders a little bit ahead New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. Interesting that the Iowa polls are much tighter on the Democratic side in Iowa than they are nationally.
The warning I would have on the Sanders side of the equation is he's got very concentrated clusters of supporters that still only get the same number of delegates as places where his supporters are more dispersed. So the statewide poll is very bad at picking up those clusters. It might look like he has more delegates than he actually will end up having.
Great. And Selzer, thanks very much. We'll see you back in Des Moines. And when we come back, Reagan biographer Craig Shirley, author of the new book, Last Act, after this word from our sponsors. Wait till you see what we do for Arbor Day. If you follow Republican politics, you might get the sense that the candidates for president really, really like Ronald Reagan. Recently, we were visited by someone who is one of the most prolific Reaganites on this planet, Craig Shirley. His new book is called Last Act. It's one of many books about the 40th president. So what sets Craig's book apart? We asked him. So, Craig, you've written two books about Reagan before. There are lots of books about President Reagan.
Yes.
What is different about this one?
Well, nobody's ever written about the end of his life, and that's what it's about. I was working on a previous Reagan book about 4 or 5 years ago, and my then 11-year-old son, Mitchell, was highlighting all these binders. You know, I had, not binders of women, but binders of news clips and material from the Reagan Library, and he was supposed to go through it. Every time Reagan's name came up, he was supposed to highlight it. And my books have always been family affairs. Zareen, my wife, does all my editing and creative input, and my boys have done research, and my daughter's done, fact checking and things like that. So, anyway, he said about 9 o'clock one night, he says to nobody in particular, he says, "Dad, has anybody ever done a book about Reagan after he was president?" And I thought for a moment, and I said, no. And I started looking into it and realized that, he lived for 16 years after he left the White House. There was a lot of living that went on in those 16 years.
Well, talk about that a little bit. I mean, there are presidents now for whom the post-presidency matters a huge amount. Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton have had big post-presidencies. What are the highlights or the most important parts of Reagan's post-presidency?
Reagan never used the word retirement, but I also think he was tired. He was the oldest president. He left office, and he was tired. There's no doubt about it. And he needed to get back to California, get back to the ranch. He needed to, recharge his batteries. But he was always active too. But he didn't worry about his legacy the way Carter did and others did, but because he left so popular and so successful. So, he never, Lou Cannon once told me, he interviewed Reagan many times, but Reagan never used the word legacy and would resist talking about it. His attitude was that the American people think I did a good job, then that'll be good enough for me. And so he was not obsessed. I mean, he did a presidential library. He did 2 books afterward. There was a lot of, he was knighted by the Queen. There were speeches in London. There were speeches in Moscow. He met with Gorbachev 3 more times after leaving the White House. So he was always active. He went whitewater rafting. He went for a blimp ride, you know. But he also just put, I think in a way he compartmentalized his time in Washington and put that aside. And then, as a matter of fact, his diary entry, his last diary entry says, then home to California is start of a new life. He was done being president, and now he's going to move on to something else.
You listed a lot of things that were eventful. Obviously, one of the things that gets most discussed in this period of his life was the illness that he had. And there's been some debate about the trajectory of that and the timing of that. Talk about the debate and what you see as the truth.
I think the truth, the facts as they exist, Mark, is that AIDS came and went and saw him for 8 years. There's his schedule, there's his diary, there's his letter writing, there's his activity. Is that to a person, everybody from James A. Baker to Ed Meese to Marlon Fitzwater to A.B. Culverhouse, all the key people who were there either all 8 years or part of the 8 years or to the end of the 8 years, say that Reagan was just as active and vital on January of 1989 as he was in January of 1981. There was no sign whatsoever of the Alzheimer's. In fact, you know, he went to the Mayo Clinic every year to be diagnosed, for an annual medical checkup, physiological and psychological, and he passed every year with flying colors.
So what's the earliest you think that it started to show?
Well, the first Mayo says the first detection of early onset Alzheimer's was in the spring of 1984, or 94, which would have been 6 years after leaving the White House.
How do you think the way that they handled the illness, right, became also an important kind of a milestone in a way, right? Because a lot of presidents in the past, when they had gotten ill, even after they'd left office, concealed their illnesses. Nobody knew they were sick until they actually were dead. Just talk about the way in which that the decision was made to bring his illness into the public.
He made the decision himself. In fact, he wrote about it in his letter about Nancy's breast cancer and her other surgeries and his own bouts with colon cancer and things like that. And they decided to, almost to the day that he was told by the doctors, he sat down and wrote the letter to the American people. But I think now the modern standard is
disclosure.
all disclosure, absolutely. I don't think you can keep things from the American people.
Our thanks to author Craig Shirley. His book, The Last Act, out now. We'll be right back with some news about us, the Iowa State Fairgrounds, and Mr. Donald Trump after this word from our sponsors.
We are live 24/7 on BloombergPolitics.com. We're on the tube twice a day at 5 and at 8. But starting Monday, we're going to be on for 1 full hour in each of those slots. You asked for it, you got it, and now you're going to have to deal with it.
And our guest on Monday will be Donald Trump. That's on Monday. We'll talk to him from Woolman Rink right here in New York City in Central Park. Happy Halloween, everybody. Good luck, Mets. Until next week, sayonara.